Whenever I read this parable, I think of where we get off the Katy Freeway to go into Houston every once in a while. We get off at Durham and Shepherd, and if you go left onto the freeway, you go through a section of town which is sort of run down. And if you're there in the morning, there's a lot of men standing on the street corners waiting to be picked up for a daily hire. If you come back in the afternoon, as we do, there's still a few old guys on the corner who obviously haven't been picked up for the daily work because probably they're too old. That's the picture I have in mind for this parable. It's an interesting parable. It has very little to do with economics, although there's something to be said for the economics of the parable. At least they were getting a daily wage, which meant enough to live on for a day. When Jesus first spoke this parable, he was probably talking to his first disciples, the Peter, James, and John crowd, the one who had left their families and their businesses and come off on the road after Jesus. Because by this time, the crowd around Jesus was picking up after a few years. And I'm sure that the early comers thought that they were sort of the upper crust of the community of Jesus, or whatever they called it in those days. And I think the parable was originally directed to them, that even though you were the first to follow me, even though you were a cradle Catholic, no, you're no better than those who come late. Converts. Well, they were all converts. But by the time the parable got written down by Matthew probably had another group in mind, because his church was basically a Gentile church, a Greek church. And I'm sure that the original members of the church who were Jewish were probably a bit upset about all these others who were coming in and joining. After all, we are the chosen people, So he was directing it to another group of people, the parishioners who were upset about the newcomers. And that may be more current than we think. But we're 21 centuries later, and so how do we read the parable? I don't think the parable has that much to do with the laborers. I think the parable is about the owner of the vineyard. Because the complaint of the first hired sounds to me like the complaint of the eldest son in the story of the prodigal son. I have worked for you all these years and blah, 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 and you have never done this for me, what you're doing for this guy who went off and shot everything he had and lived an immoral life. I think it's aimed at the generosity of the owner of the vineyard, who pretty obviously represents God our Father. And the point is that we need to remember a very overused word in Christian vocabulary and to really remember what it means. And that is the word grace. We throw it around all the time, but what does it really mean? Grace. Hail Mary, full of grace. God gave me this grace. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. What does the word grace mean? It means something free for nothing, something you don't deserve, something you have not earned, something you have not worked for, something which is not a reward for your goodness or your fidelity or your love even. It's pure gift. It's gratuitous. It's a gratuity. It's something which we are given with no reason why we should be given it. In other words, the love of God which overflows into a saving activity of Jesus is a gift. It's a grace. It's not earned. And we spend most of our lives thinking we're earning it, unfortunately, because that always puts us in a bad position, because we can't earn it. We can't earn God's grace and love because we're never that worthy. But we have it anyway. And that's one of the reasons why we gather on Sunday morning together to do Eucharist. because Eucharist is just the Greek translation of the reverse of grace. It's the gratitude that we owe to God for the grace that has been given to us. And when you stop to think about what we have been given, just start off with being. Is there any reasonable or compelling reason why you exist? You. I don't mean human beings in general. I mean you. Is there any reason why you exist? You may be the most brilliant person in the world or the dumbest person in the world. But there's no compelling reason why you or I exist except the love of God, who called us into being. What we do with our being is something else, but he calls us into being. And then everything else coming down the pike is gift, health, intelligence, ongoing life. And finally, after our problems amass, he gives us Christ, who pulls us out of the mess we get ourselves into, gratuitously, free for nothing. So this is not a parable about, socioeconomic systems. It's not about the just wage. All those things follow in our lives if we live if we live graciously and in gratitude to what God has given us. We begin to be that way with each other. We begin to become gracious to each other, to give to each other without counting the cost to ourselves or the worth of each other. So the parable isn't about wages or workers, it's about us and God. And Jesus is saying, everything is a gift. Be grateful. God does not treat us as we deserve. Thank God.